Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Data for Food 2030 podcast. In today's episode, I'm very delighted to welcome Kelly Rijswijk and together we will speak about the future scenarios of the data economy for food systems. So Kelly, welcome and thank you very much for joining our podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Nefeli. I'm really looking forward.
Let's see. So as I mentioned, you lead the work on the future scenarios of the data economy for food systems. So could you tell us a little bit more about your role and what you actually do within the Data for Food 2030 project?
Yeah, sure. So the aim of this project, and I'm sure it's been talked about in the other podcasts as well, is to have a fair, inclusive, innovative data economy for sustainable food systems. So all sorts of big keywords. And one of the tasks within this project is to better understand this element of fair and inclusive. And how do you make it something fair and inclusive is by talking to people and understanding what their perspectives and views and expectations are of a data economy for food systems. So within the work that I lead, we've talked to very many different people to get sort of an idea of what the future data economy for food systems could look like. And we drew some scenarios up from their input and create some pathways out of that as well. But I'm sure we'll talk about that in a bit more detail.
Yes, of course. And first of all, I would like to ask you, how did you gather the input you needed to shape these scenarios?
Yeah, so we, together with people from the project, so different partners in different countries, 6 different countries actually, we created a set of workshops and which were held in each of these countries with a whole lot of stakeholders to gather input. So that was the main modus thing that we've done, to have workshops.
Thank you very much. And who did you engage with during your surveys and workshop, and why was it important to include their own perspectives?
So who did we engage with? In another piece of research, we created sort of 4 categories of people. So you have the food value chain actors, so that's from your farmers, your processors, all the way through to your consumers. That was one category of people. Then we had a second category of people who are more about supporting a food system. So that could be researchers or policymakers or people that provide the framework in which the food value chain can operate, basically. Then we had a third category that we classified as data actors. So all of the people that work on digital platforms and digital services that could support the work done in a food system. And we had a fourth category of people who come from adjacent sectors like energy, for example, or tourism. And out of those 4 categories, at each workshop, we hope to have at least some representatives. It could be farmers, it could be food processors, supermarkets, but also policymakers, other researchers. We try to have this mix of people in each national workshop so that we gathered enough input. And the reason for doing this, as said, we want to understand what fair and inclusive. And by inclusive, it means you need to have a diverse set of people with different perspectives, different backgrounds, not only from the type of work that they do, but also their gender or their age, or
exactly
a variety of things that we tried to select for as far as we could. Yeah.
So you engaged a very broad category of people, including everyone actually.
As far as we could, Yes. Everyone is part of the food system. We all eat.
Yes, and everybody's perspective is needed to actually create and build these scenarios.
Yeah, to some extent, yes. Yeah, in order to make it useful scenarios, but also useful input in how to design a data economy that people can work with. It's nice to have a good variety of perspectives, definitely.
Sure. Yeah. And can you walk us through the process you followed to actually build the future scenario?
Yeah, sure.
And of course, can you also explain a little bit the steps that you used to go from insight to vision?
Yeah, so what we did, and this is a bit hard to hear by voice, but we sort of went wide first and then we went back in. So we diverged and we converged. And we diverged by having 6 countries, 6 workshops, and they all created scenarios. That was step 1. And what we did, we converged, so we got all of the scenarios back together to see, out of those national level scenarios, can we build EU level scenarios. So we got inputs from Slovenia and from Spain and from the Netherlands and Belgium and Poland and Latvia, trying to see whether we could make it EU level scenarios. And once we had those together, we went back to these 6 countries, did another round of workshops to see, okay, do people agree with this? Do they recognize elements from it? And if we now have these scenarios, how do we actually get to this future image? What do we need to do? What input do we need to provide? What sort of resources, what sort of activities do we need to take in order to make sure that we meet these scenarios, or at least the desirable part of the scenario, because scenarios can be both good and bad at the same time, or good for some people but not good for other people. So we did a 2-step process, basically. Yeah.
Yes, as I imagine, it required a lot of work, a lot of back and forth.
Yeah, just to make sure that we really got people's perspectives right, rather than us researchers assuming what people think and say and do and how they feel and perceive a data economy. We really wanted to check in with them at least twice to hear, are we on the right path, and do you really think this is the way to create a fair and inclusive data economy for food systems?
Yes, and it has to be real people, real insights, not just assumptions and
Absolutely.
like academic guesses. So
yeah.
Great, thank you very, very much. And I know this is going to be a bit difficult, but could you describe the 3 scenarios that finally emerged through your research?
I can, but indeed it's going to be a lot of talking from my side. So we had one scenario which was really a consumer-oriented scenario about personal and healthy diets. The second scenario, and I'll elaborate on them in a second, but the second scenario was about local and transparent value chains, and the third one was about strictly regulated high-tech for reduced environmental impacts. So the first one about personal healthy diets was about collecting a lot of consumer information, including your DNA, to see what sort of food would suit you best, what fits you, what makes you the most healthy person you can be. And in that scenario, but the stakeholder said it will be a centralized database in which we take all of that DNA information, consumer behavior information, and so on, lifestyle information. And out of that, we generate these personalized diets. And of course, that comes with some challenges as well, because do we want to centralize all of that data? Who can access all of that data? But also food is also a fun thing. It's a social activity. It has cultural practices related to it. So if I tell you can only eat green apples from now on, it probably doesn't it makes you maybe a very healthy person, but not necessarily a very happy person. Because food is also about sharing and
pleasure.
Yeah, and pleasure. And if we sit at a dinner table and you can only eat green apples and I can only eat red apples, there's something lacking about sharing. So each scenario comes with a lot of positive things, like a healthier society, and good insights about consumer behavior, which is also, for example, useful for farmers, because they can better understand what the demands are. And if there's a large demand for green apples but not red apples, you can imagine the farmers would say, okay, well, on my orchard, I will start growing green apples only, because that's in high demand because of health reasons. So there's positive sides to it, but it also has downsides. So that's the first scenario. Then we have a second scenario on local and transparent value chains. And the idea was, it's a scenario that we also know right now, in the sense that people want to buy local and preferably organic, and have transparency about where your food comes from, better understand how's my food produced, where has it been grown, which cow was involved in the milk that I drink, for example. So that was the idea behind the scenarios, to make that even more insightful. That from the Spanish workshop, there was a really nice word that they came up with. It was about collective consciousness. By collecting more data about the way our food is produced and where it comes from, and keeping that local, we also become more aware, hopefully, in the transparency about how we grow our food and make better food choices. So that was one scenario, and whereas in the first scenario the government had a big role, in the second scenario the government, for example, had a lot less of a bigger role, or smaller role, I should say. They thought, if it's locally organized, we don't have a lot of government involvement.
Yes.
We can organize this amongst ourselves and make sure that, for example, through a blockchain technology, we share the data with each other and create that in transparency.
And also nowadays there is a growing demand for from consumers to actually know what they eat, where it comes from, is it organic, does it make a good impact on my health? So this scenario is actually something that really happens now.
Yeah, exactly. So the scenarios are written based on trends that we identified in another research task that we had in this project. And we asked all of these people to pick a couple of these trends and put them together, and then think through, okay, if we put these trends together, what are the technological implications or the social implications or legal, and what's the story that comes out of it? That's sort of how we created the scenario. And we asked people to think about 2050, which is a long way out, and people struggled a bit with that. So the three scenarios, and I'll talk about the third one in a second, but the three scenarios are all scenarios that in part are already taking place to some extent. There are also three scenarios that are not mutually exclusive. They can live next to each other, and all of them will be true to some extent, both the positive and the negative aspects of each scenario.
Good to know. Great. Thank you very much. And what about the third scenario?
The third scenario. So that's the most high-tech one. We're in a data project, in a digital project. And people that we invited saw, and this is the story about the high-tech farm, the precision agriculture, the farmer who's also a data manager. And in this scenario, the title is strictly regulated, so a big role for the government when it comes to compliance of farmers with the aim of reducing environmental impact. We also had in this scenario really a discussion, or the people were discussing about the business models for farmers and sustainable livelihoods for farmers, and whether, and I'll go back to the apple, whether an apple with data should be more worth than an apple without data. So in this scenario, you also see an element of transparency, but also it shows the effort of all sorts of stakeholders in the value chain about the technological aspects they implemented, the technology that they use to collect that data. So a high-tech orchard in this case, and the green apple that you know a lot of information about, where it's been growing, how long it's been on the tree, or how healthy it is in terms of the vitamin levels, all of the things that you could measure through and show through data. That apple should be worth more in the supermarket, and that money should flow back to the farmer than an apple without all of that information that was gained through technology. So yeah, three different scenarios, going from a consumer-oriented scenario and a health-oriented scenario to a local and transparent, more perhaps organic scenario, and a third one which is really about technology and on-farm perspectives.
Thank you very much for this very good introduction of these scenarios. And now that we have all this information, we know some things about these three scenarios. Were there any common values or priorities that emerged across all three scenarios? Things that people clearly envision for the food systems of the future? Yeah,
so as said, we created the scenarios and then validated them again with all of the people we invited to the workshops. And we created pathways, which is a bit of a fancy word for saying, okay, we have a scenario for the future, now how do we get there? And in thinking through how do we get there, we saw that people found a couple of things really important. One of them is that, and I already mentioned it, sustainable livelihood for farmers, making sure that they get the data that they provide into the value chain, that they also get some feedback on it, either about the quality of their products or any demand information, so that they know what to grow, but also money for all of the technological investments that they've done. So are there other business models, and that is sort of another thing, are there more business models that we can generate with the data economy than the ones that we're already familiar with. So livelihood for farmers was important, new business models was important, but we also found that the data economy, we often have a very monetary or financial way of thinking about it, but data could also provide perhaps other types of services, create other values that are more socially or culturally or more important for the environment. So whether we can all turn that into, in this case, euros, is questionable, but worthwhile investigating as well. So people also thought we shouldn't forget about the environment and about the actual people in these scenarios. They also thought that was important.
Of course, and as you mentioned, they have a lot of things in common and they can coexist.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're not mutually exclusive, as you mentioned, so these can all happen at the same time.
And it is already happening to some extent at the same time. So it's the scenarios are showing a potential pathway into the future where we do the things that we want to keep from what we're doing now, do them in a better way and in a more suitable way for everyone involved. But the things that we dislike, that are undesirable or negative for the environment or for a variety of stakeholders, how can we make sure that we don't continue doing them in the way that we are currently doing it?
Exactly. And how can these scenarios be used in practice? For example, by policymakers, industry actors, or citizens even, who want to understand where data economy for food systems are heading?
Yeah, I'm not sure if a lot of citizens are always concerned with this topic. If you're in the supermarket, for example, I'm not sure you're thinking about the data economy, because that's a really complex and abstract sort of word. But what we did do with the work that we've done, we created 3 pictures, call them conversation starters if you like, and in these scenario pictures you can use them as practical examples of what the future might look like, to have discussions with other people. So that could be a useful starting point also for policymakers. And what we did furthermore in this project, that we wrote some policy recommendations for policymakers. So we did zoom in largely on policymakers. But by collecting all of this input from stakeholders, I think we also pushed that a definition of a data economy should be something that's understandable and useful to a large variety of people, not just researchers, because it's something that we all make use of knowingly or unknowingly, basically. So to some extent practical, but also more food for thought, really.
Great, thank you very, very much. And now one final question before we finish for today. If you had to leave listeners with one key message from your research about the future scenarios, what should they remember about building data economy for food systems that people trust and support?
Yeah, I find this rather challenging question because, as I said, the data economy is something very intangible and a complex sort of word. But maybe that is part of the recommendation, or the thing I would like to say is that we maybe should not worry too much about the concept data economy, but more how we organize it. So really strive for this fair and inclusive element. Not forget the people that make use of the data economy every day by sharing data, by buying food, and especially for policymakers, I think we should really take that message into account. This is ultimately about people and how we produce and consume food, and whether that's with a lot of data and a lot of technology or without any, all of these options should be possible as long as that's what we commonly decide. So I think taking people into account is very important.
Of course, and thank you very much for sharing all these very interesting results of your research with us today and for participating in our podcast.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you. And as for you, dear viewers and listeners, thank you very much for watching this episode. And don't forget to stay tuned for all the next episodes.